Physicist John Wheeler said, "As our island of knowledge grows, so does the shore of our ignorance." Suppose you draw a circle. You'll see, bigger the circle you draw, longer is going to be its perimeter or the boundary. This is the same for our knowledge. If we learn a little, then we realize that we are ignorant of much more. As Socrates say, knowing this fact that we are ignorant is true wisdom. Well, this is all that we understand, and this is the kind of philosophical mindset most of us have about ego. Ego, egoism, pride, whatever you call it. This is not all that is about ego. This is just called conceit. It is just a mere expression of what ego is. The ego that we are so concerned about is far, far more interesting. Let us find out in this episode. Hi, welcome to the 4th episode of Master Within podcast. I am Souvik Ghosh, the host of this show. Each week, I bring you a unique perspective to deal with your mind and help you master the most effective time management or social skills so that you can become more happy, productive, and successful. Just Google the word ego on the internet. You'll find plethora of quotes, information about how ego is harmful for our growth and relationships. But again, we find many comments about lacking self-esteem, inferiority complex, and many more things, where a person questions his own ego. If we look into the history, Lord Krishna on one side is said to be the playful boy with dissolved ego. And again, on the other side, he is the person who says so proudly, "Follow me, Arjuna, and fight, for none can harm my devotees." Okay, what about Lord Jesus? On one hand, he is the humble son of man, the wandering carpenter. And on the other, he says, "No one can reach to the Father but through me." Are they being egoistic? Or are they humble? What is this paradox with ego? So as we can see, we don't actually have the proper understanding of what ego is. If we don't have our understanding of what this is, then how do we expect to manage it and use it to our benefit? Before that, tell me, do you have any question about your own existence? No, you can question your surroundings. But one thing is very clear, that this I, this self exists. Someone called me is looking or listening at this very moment. This someone, this feeling of self is the basis of ego. When I am, then ego is. It's just that simple. In Sanskrit, ego is called aham, meaning I or myself. No matter what happens, we want to sustain our being. So we have a natural tendency to expand and establish ourselves in our environment through our words, deeds, and expressions. This is the dharma or the property of ourself. It wants to be and become. It is through this that we are connected to everyone at the same time, maintaining our distinctiveness. Here, our problem lies. The moment this nature of self-establishment goes berserk, in those tiny subtle moments when we don't realize our conscience will receive a self-establishment overdose. We then develop what we call obsessed ego. It is in times like these we recognize people as egoistic in nature. This obsessed ego brings addiction. Then addiction breeds self-interest. That narrow self-interest gives birth to passion, which is again source of anger, and anger begets violence. The moment we are born, we don't necessarily feel this ego completely or separately. We feel a sense of union with our mother as we sustain our nourishment through her milk. This is the first time we form a complex in our brain, as psychologists call it, Oedipus complex. With growth, we soon become aware of our environment and try to establish ourselves. This is the moment our ego starts developing within us gradually. One day, Eugene Spencer, a devotee of Master, asked him about what is the nature of ego, and they were having a long discussion. At the end of it, Master replied, "After coming in conflict with the impulse from outside, that which asserts to exist is called the ego. So ego is neither good nor bad. Ego is just ego." I'm repeating the statement. After coming in conflict with the impulse from outside, that which asserts to exist is called the ego. So ego is neither bad nor good. Ego is just ego. So to make it simple, we want to exist, and our ego is entwined with our existence. In the pursuit of truth, Master writes, as long as our body lasts, this individuality will also last. So long as modes of mind remain, the ego persists. But the more passive one can remain, placing one's pride in the ideal, the more selfless and more tolerant he is. The ideal that he speaks about is not just a mere idea or a philosophy, but a real man in flesh and blood. No matter how much philosophy we acquire, it is nothing without its practical demonstrator. As long as we aren't attached to the ideal of an existential idea, so long we cannot go beyond the clutches of this obsessed ego. If we are only attached to some philosophy, we are always prone to obsession. Then even if we serve the society or become a great teacher, the ego of being a social worker or the conceit of knowledge can attack us at the times we are most unaware of. And it will surely harm us in the worst possible way in all other sectors of our life. We can be the richest man, but the loneliest as well. We can be the most knowledgeable person, but we can have a poor health. So the key is to keep our ego passive in a higher ideal. It is only through surrender that our ego becomes our strength. Now, you may feel tremendous pressure or repulsion with this act of being passive, with this act of surrendering. But recognize, this is the ego or the obsessed ego that's reacting within you. And fighting this battle varies from person to person. Generally, there are two ways to break this barrier, to win this war. Either through tough moments of life, when our ego becomes thin or shattered. And there is another good way, that is through love and devotion. Through love and service to the ideal, we can easily feel a sense of attachment, and the ego naturally becomes passive. Master writes, the more rigid the ego, the greater the ignorance, the lighter the pride, the brighter the knowledge. In Mahabharata, we can see at one hand how Karna, out of his conceit of giving away, gave away his own shield of survival, joined hands with the wrong people, and lost the battle. On the other hand, devotees like Hanuman, Arjuna, Vivekananda came out virtuous even after having their shortcomings in their life. They transformed themselves in the entire process. This is the way to live. The earth moves around the sun. The electrons revolve around the nucleus. The cell has its own nucleus. So we too need a center, or we are bound to fail. And it must be an ideal. So who is a man just like us? It is through such a master we can awaken the master that lies within us. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Master Within podcast. In this episode, we have learned how ego originates within us, how it can become the obsessed ego, or on the other hand, how it can become the ego that can exalt our being. To get a more detailed research and discussion on this content, please visit www.masterwithin.org. And an important notice: if you have any kind of suggestion regarding the length of this episode, whether it should be 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 20 minutes, please let us know. You can mail us at masterwithin.official@gmail.com, or you can comment us anywhere on our social media with the handle masterwithinofficial. It will be very helpful for me. And you can subscribe to this show from Spotify, Ghana, JioSaavn, Apple Podcast, and from any other audio platform. Thank you so much for listening. I'll catch you guys on the next episode. Egotism that refuses to increase one's ability is the ego that Satan breathes into.